friends. Here's the question. Should we align ourselves with the powers that be in this world? And there's a lot of powers in this world, so I'm not going to get specific other than just to say there's a lot we can align ourselves to. And that's very powerful in this world. So, spoiler alert, the answer is no. We should not be aligning ourselves with the powers that be, but align ourselves with the power, who is God. Then we can discern what kind of relationships we're going to have with powerful people in this world, powerful corporations or government or political parties or any number of other situations like that. But we have to first align ourselves with the power, who is God, like the power of the whole universe, like the universal king, right? So let's look at the scriptures for this. And I want us to go to the prophet Isaiah and his dialogue with God and the king at that time, King Ahaz, who was the king of the northern tribes, which were located in Israel. And here's the background. So Assyria is rising up as a power to be. It's the rising power in the ancient Near East, and it's going to become quite the empire. And on its ascent up, there is still another empire that's pretty powerful, and that's the empire of the Pharisees, the empire of Israel. And what they're doing is there's some threat, and Israel is afraid that Egypt's going to invade them or any number of other things are going to happen to them. So they want to avert that by aligning themselves with Assyria, which is this godless nation. And God is saying through Isaiah to the king and therefore to the people, please no, don't do that. He's saying, trust in me. Trust in me as the power in your life. Let me lead you. Let me guide you. Let me protect you. Right? Let me get you through whatever the ups and downs of human life are, living in a broken world. But don't align yourself with Assyria in order to avert being overtaken by Egypt. Well, King Ahaz, as you can imagine, does not follow the prophet of God. And when he does not follow him, he makes an alliance with Assyria. And yes, Assyria protects Israel, meaning Egypt doesn't end up invading Israel. Assyria does. And takes them over as a vassal state. And then starts doing terrible things to them and terrible taxations in order to fuel them and give them the means to continue to oppress Israel with their own money. Well, along the way, too, of course, Assyria brings their gods, who are, of course, false gods. They don't actually exist. But we can't really say that they don't exist. They're not gods. They're not good gods. They're not gods at all, but they are demonic. And we know that. We know that from theology. We know that certainly from history. For instance, the gods of the Assyrians would often ask their people to sacrifice their own children to appease the gods. And this was a way for the gods to keep the people under their rule. These were no gods. These were fallen angels who were demons. And they did exist, and they were controlling the people. They had convinced the people that this was somehow a good thing. And aren't we living in a similar age now where we're telling people it's good to sacrifice their children for their gods? The god of their body, the god of their career, the god of whatever, right? Yeah, we're right back in that situation again. And what's the result? The result is God does not punish Israel. Israel punishes itself. And by that I mean it made its bed and it lied in it. And so it reaped the consequences of what it sowed, right? Using two different images, but they both fit. Great suffering came upon Israel because of its alliance with Assyria. First of all, Assyria lied to them. Imagine that, a bunch of politicians lying, right? Lied to them. They didn't deliver what they promised. In fact, the exact opposite. They enslaved them themselves rather than Egypt, which was no better in regards to enslavement. And Israel lived through 400 years of that with Egypt. So that they also then wanted to bring their own culture, meaning their own values, their own priorities, their own ways of controlling the people. Make no mistake about it. Not much has changed under the sun. Just like the Assyrians used their culture at that time to control the people, we live now in again a godless age in which we've created a culture, and that culture is used to control the people. Right? And what is behind both of them is something not of God at all. But God didn't do this to the people. The people did this themselves, and God allowed them to live out the consequences. Why? It's not because he's not a merciful God and he doesn't love his people. He is a merciful God and he does love them. And so he allows them to reap what they sow. And then over time, as they reap what they sow, some of the Jews started to come back to their senses. Come back to like common sense. And come back to what really is important in life and what their values are based upon their religion. And they got their priorities straightened out and they rejected the false god, started worshiping God again and coming back into a covenant relationship with him again. And life became good again in so many ways, as is the case with God, always. And that's what's happening to us as Catholic Christians today and Christians throughout the world and up and down the ages. We often find ourselves putting our trust in the powers that be in this age without really even understanding and acknowledging what we're giving away to them when we buy their culture wholesale, when we follow their politics, when we don't fight against their laws and their rules, right? When we buy all of their products and put all that stuff into our bodies and the bodies of our kids. When we turn on a TV and we set our kid in front of that video game for 3 or 4 hours, or that Netflix that we ourselves binge upon, do we really understand that we are just worshiping new gods? And they're not gods at all, but they end up enslaving our minds. They end up enslaving our feelings. You know, we can't deny that part of, for instance, the surge in the last few decades of violence in the United States is related to some of the violence that we expose our kids to, right? I mean, why would we ever try to deny that unless we bought the farm, unless we believe the lie? People believed Ahaz and everything that he was promising, and Ahaz believed Assyria and everything Assyria was promising, and the exact opposite happened. And the people suffered. And we see a lot of people today suffering from loneliness, from depression, right? And part of that is that we bought into this. I'm not calling this evil, okay? This is a tool like anything else, and it can be used for good, and it can be used for evil, right? But when our husbands are addicted to porn on this, right, and then their sons are addicted to this, this is a false god that is using this for evil. And we allow our sons to be alone in their rooms with those kinds of stuff. I'm just giving you an example of, among many things in our culture today, right? Where we make alliances with the powers that be. And a lot of times we don't even understand the consequences of those. In the case of Israel, they made that alliance and they ended up sacrificing their own children, killing their children to appease these gods who were demons. And again, we see that with men and women who are sacrificing the children in the wombs of the women of our society, in order to the powers that be say, this is what's good for you, and this is what will bring you happiness, and this is what will bring you freedom. And they sacrifice their children for their jobs or for their bodies or for their looks or for their freedoms, and they end up getting exactly the opposite, right? And there's still people out marching in the streets for these so-called rights. My God, how we have been duped. How we've been duped. But Isaiah and what happened with Ahaz and Assyria and afterwards is a tale worth telling. Because when that suffering came on wholesale to a nation, after a while, and it did take time, there was a group of them that came to their senses. And that's what we're seeing among, for instance, many Christians today who we, like a lot of others, bought the lies of our culture. And by the way, there's a lot of good things in our culture, right? I just gave one example of a phone. A computer can be, a nice glass of wine can be, or a beer, or a vacation, or the fact that we have work. We live in a society where we have access to jobs. Those are good things. But those jobs, if we make them into isms, like workaholism, they can become bad. You know, for the sake of greed or pride or ego or whatever. We always just have to be attentive to the powers that be. Because pride is a power. Ego is a power. Lust is a power. Greed is a power. They're all powers that be. And we just have to be aware that we're not serving them, that we're trusting in God. So that, you know, we don't grasp for other things in our greed. We're trusting in God and following Him, so we're not lusting for other things, that we give our hearts first and foremost to God. And when we don't, then there will be consequences. And God will allow us to live out those consequences. The strange thing is that we often then accuse God for what we are suffering that we brought on ourselves. It's not God. Because we want Him to do something about it, but He's like, no, we're going to play this out so that you come back to your senses, or your children come back to their senses, right? And that's not an act of an unmerciful God. That is an act of mercy through which He is recovering our sensibilities, our common sense, our sense of the faith, our sense of what is true and right and good and noble and beautiful. And when we do that, then like in the age of Israel, many came back to Him, came back to a covenant, and they found the freedom that they were looking for all along. And the same goes with you and I to this day, living now again in a pagan world as Christians. Never give up hope for yourself or your children, your loved ones, for our church, for our land, our nation that we love so much. Don't give in to pessimism and negativism. Give in to the truth. And let the truth and love and goodness and what is right and noble and true and beautiful set you free. Let those be the powers that you follow that lead you to the one power. And that one power has the power of overcoming everything, including even our own suffering, and even the suffering that is from our own hands, from the lies that we believed about ourselves. Until next time, friends.